I still might think you've got a bunch of
Yes.
You do.
That's good, man.
Andy?
I'm glad to see us coming back.
Yeah, exactly.
We're all coming back. The gang's here. We are thrilled to be here with an incredibly broad, incredibly deep, bipartisan, bicameral coalition for surveillance reform. Our legislation proposes a comprehensive surveillance reform bill for the digital age. We call it the Government Surveillance Reform Act. Americans understand that it's possible to confront our country's adversaries ferociously without throwing our constitutional rights into the garbage can. But for too long, the surveillance laws haven't kept up with changing times. Decades ago, when Congress first wrote these surveillance laws, it focused on the way surveillance was conducted back then. That was largely by having government agents demanding assistance from the telephone company. Congress largely left unregulated the other ways that the government could spy on Americans. Today, of course, we're part of a global communications network, and government agencies can collect Americans' emails and texts in all sorts of new ways. That includes surveillance under Section 702, Executive Order 12333, and by purchasing Americans' personal information from all kinds of shady, unregulated data brokers. Now, our founding fathers made it clear that if government agencies want to read an American's private communications, they should get a warrant. But today, America's intelligence agencies hoover up large volumes of electronic communications, and they claim they have a right to search individual Americans' texts and emails without getting a warrant. They don't have that right, and it's time for the law to reflect that. Our bill continues to give government agencies broad authority to collect information on threats at home and abroad, including the ability to act quickly in emergencies and settle up with a court later on. It does create much stronger protections for privacy of law-abiding Americans and restores the warrant protections that are at the heart of the Fourth Amendment. We also end the outdated distinction that says Americans have fewer rights if they're overseas. If the government is collecting their information overseas or through payments to these shady data brokers, protections for your private information shouldn't change based simply on where you are or how and where the information is collected. Today, finally, there's a bill that reflects that. The reason we're up here and why we've worked for months now to pull together this unprecedented, bipartisan, bicameral coalition is that we believe the reforms we're laying out are just common sense. I think everybody up here would agree that lately you haven't seen a lot of major legislation that has this kind of broad, sweeping coalition behind it. In an era when so much divides our country, this legislation elevates principles that have united us for years and years. The people of this country care deeply about our security. We care deeply about our constitutional rights. And our constituents are saying, hey, folks, those two aren't mutually exclusive. We can do both. So if you ask Americans from Multnomah County in my home state to Butler County, Ohio, do you want to live in a country where no one has privacy rights? They say overwhelmingly, no way. On this fundamental issue, Americans agree on what they want for our nation. We're introducing a bill that protects both American security and Americans' liberty, because from Ben Franklin's time until today, Americans understand they simply do not have to sacrifice one to get the other. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my partner. Senator Mike Lee has been a tireless and skilled advocate for surveillance reform, and I want to thank him for working together with all of us. Senator Lee.
Thanks so much, Senator Wyden. Thanks to all of you for being here. The protections that we now enjoy under the Fourth Amendment long predate 1791. In fact, they were well established before the United States became a country under English law. Inconsistently followed at times, yes, but they were well established. In 1763, the day before Easter, a member of British Parliament named John Wilkes was arrested. His offense was an interesting one. It had to do with his publication of a series of sort of a magazine called the North Briton. It was North Briton number 45 that crossed a line. All of the North Briton episodes had included in one way or another some criticisms of King George III and his ministers. But number 45 crossed the line, in part because it criticized King George III's use of things like writs of assistance and general warrants. If you don't know what those are, they're basically things that say, go find people who have broken the law, search their homes, search their persons, seize whatever you find. That was it. No particularity requirement, no evidence of any kind of fact establishing probable cause. That's the problem we're dealing with here. A couple of, 2.5 centuries later, and the problem is still somewhat analogous to that. For the 12.5 years, almost 13 years that I've been in the Senate, I've been sounding the alarm on what I see as an excessively, increasingly cavalier approach taken by the FBI in connection with its use of these foreign intelligence authorities, and especially the way they approach our privacy. Look, these authorities exist for good reason. They exist so that we can obtain information on foreign adversaries, not on the American people. That is the distinction that we're concerned about here. We are not saying no 702. We are not saying no FISA. We're saying we need these authorities, but we need to reform these authorities because they've been abused, specifically insofar as they've been weaponized against Americans. Now, just this year, we've learned that the FBI illegally surveilled 19,000 donors to a congressional campaign. Happened to be focused on a lot of people who were involved in protests in the summer of 2020, people who just happened to be in Washington, D.C. on January 6th, regardless of whether they ever came within a country mile of the Capitol. And that they've also surveilled at least one member of the House of Representatives and at least one member of the Senate. They must have figured as long as we're going to go after one house, we've got to make sure we get the other one. I wonder whether they also had a bipartisan arrangement. I don't know, because to the best of my knowledge, we don't know who those members of Congress were. Now, they call this sort of thing non-compliance. I find that clever. And it's also highly euphemistic and downright insulting, frankly. Non-compliance is what happens when somebody forgets, despite their best efforts, to fill out a form, or they forget to put a period at the end of a sentence when they should have put one. But when the FBI snoops on the American people without a warrant, it's not a blunder. It's a breach of trust, and it's a violation of the Constitution. So asking for trust while trampling on the rights of Americans isn't oversight. It's oversight turned a blind eye. The only thing FBI seems eager to fix is getting caught. And so that's why we've got to act here and now. Hundreds of thousands of warrantless searches a year, hundreds of thousands. That's very substantial. When every illegal search violates an American's constitutional rights, the right number for that is 0. It should be 0. Our privacy isn't just a suggestion, it is in fact a constitutional guarantee. Look, the clock's ticking on 702. It's set to expire and it's time for a trade. We will vote to reauthorize, but only with rules that make Uncle Sam get a warrant before entering our digital domains, our homes, our papers, our persons. That is, after all, where most Americans store nearly all of their papers these days, is in digital form. So the Government Surveillance Reform Act would end warrantless backdoor searches of Americans within this Section 702 database, prohibit the targeting of foreigners for the purposes of collecting Americans' communications, and ensure intelligence agencies' employees are in fact held accountable when they violate these things. Because right now, They sort of like the unarmed English Bobby being unarmed upon seeing a violation of the law, says stop, or I'll yell stop again, but it sounds that much more gentle given the British accent going along with it. We're not going to put up with this anymore. We're going to reform it, and that's what this bill does. It also protects American civil liberties by expanding the amicus curiae provisions and expanding amici participation in the FISA court proceedings and requiring DOJ to provide any material exculpatory evidence to the FISA court. We require this in other courts. We ought to require it in the FISA court. This ensures that the government can't just get around these statutory and constitutional protections by conducting also the same type of thing they'd otherwise do through a third party. It's still the government snooping on you. They're still subject to the Fourth Amendment. Just because they go through a third party doesn't give them a free pass. Our central message here is you can't bypass the Fourth Amendment. When you do, bad things happen. John Wilkes brought suit against Lord Halifax, who ordered that search and his seizure. He won. Others sued who were similarly injured. Collectively, they recovered 100,000 pounds, which is many millions of dollars in today's dollars. Today, we're going to have another revolution based on North Britain number 45, but for the modern era. Thank you.
Senator Lee and I have terrific House partners. We're going to have Congressman Davidson first.
Thank you, Senator Wyden, and I want to thank you in particular and your team, because a lot of the intellectual capital behind this bill really goes to your longstanding work on privacy. It's an honor to join this fight. Frankly, a lot of this goes back to the Patriot Act. The ideas are as old as time. We're endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But certainly part of that is the expectation of privacy. That's why our founding fathers protected it with the Fourth Amendment. Look, we all get the trade-offs on security, and as a former Army Ranger, I highly value national security. But the whole oath of office is to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, not just power. When the Patriot Act was passed in a rush after 9/11, lots of people cautioned that this is going to be abused. And it has been. And I guess it's okay to be wrong, but it's not okay to stay wrong. And that's what this legislation says. We tried it with the base text, and it isn't working out. It is being abused. The Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution does not say, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. It says you have a reasonable expectation of privacy, free from government search or seizure. It says you have due process later in our Constitution. All that's being thrown to the wind for U.S. citizens. So citizenship does matter. And the citizen should know that our government is required to get a warrant. It should know that Article 2 isn't the only part of the Constitution. And frankly, that's the spirit of Executive Order 12,333. This bill constrains the obligation to protect our security to the accountability of this legislation, to FISA, so that there can be accountability. So I could go on about all the provisions that are in it. A lot of them have been highlighted by the senators, but I am really honored to be in this effort to defend our freedom in a way that is truly bipartisan and bicameral. I hope our colleagues join it. I hope it can be the base text, frankly, and I get there's some differences, but I hope we have the process that carries the day. And I don't think we have heard all the good ideas. I hope some of them make it into final passage, because what's happened in the past is just always rolled into something else. And you can hear the talk today of the people that want to preserve the status quo. Let's just do FISA in with a CR. Let's tie it in with an omnibus. Let's avoid the fight. Let's keep the power. And gosh, isn't it so much like the Lord of the Rings, clinging to the ring of power? Cast it into the fire and destroy this sucker. I'd like to yield back.
And we're so lucky to have the Congresswoman from California who's been giving us good counsel on this hugely important issue for some time. Congresswoman.
Thank you very much, Ron. This is a bill that I've been working on all year, but actually it's an issue that I've been working on for more than a decade. This is important. Our former colleague Mo Udall once said, Everything has been said, but not everyone has said it, so I won't go through all of the provisions. I will just say that in addition to closing the backdoor search and data broker loopholes, it will prohibit reverse targeting and end the about collections in addition to the warrantless business collections and much more. You know, in 2022 alone, the FBI exploited 702 more than 200,000 times. And on the Judiciary Committee, we've had a series of FBI directors come in and tell us that was a mistake, we'll do better. These were problems that occurred under both Democratic and Republican presidents, and our solution is bipartisan too. You know, I remember years ago working with Justin Amash and also Mr. Massey and now Mr. Davidson. We have a bipartisan Fourth Amendment caucus with my co-founder Tom McClintock from California, also a member of the Judiciary Committee. This effort, after so many years, I think finally has a chance to become enacted into law. This is the best chance that we have had in many, many, many years to make sure that the Fourth Amendment, which protects Americans, is actually adhered to by the federal government. So I'm hopeful. I'm eager to work further with this. And I know that Mr. Biggs will be introduced by Ron, but I'm glad that he is here with us. And let's hope that we can get the Judiciary Committee on board and this bill on the floor passed with a large bipartisan vote. Thank you.
The Congresswoman always says it so well. We're very pleased that Congressman Biggs is here. We're going to be a bipartisan, bicameral juggernaut. And Congressman, please.
Thank you. And, you know, Zoe, it's great to be working with you. And I grew up in Mo Udall's district. And so I was going to use that line. You just took it right from me. I mean, I thought I had some proprietary claim to it. Senators Wyden and Lee, thank you for your leadership on this. And Representative Lofgren and Davidson, thank you for your leadership on this. So I'm going to nest this just in a little bit different perspective, and that is, if you look at how we are looked upon by the great American public out there, once you leave the D.C. bubble and the bubbleheads, what you get is that we are not trusted. And it isn't just that members of Congress are not trusted, is they no longer trust their federal government. And why is that? They have seen it, they've felt abused and seen government power used against them. So what is the most, one of the most obvious examples of that? It is the abuse of 702, FISA 702, and you've heard people talk about that today. Our American citizenry feel abused by our own government. And as Warren said, you can be wrong, but it is impermissible to stay wrong. And we have been wrong on this. And I know that the people behind me have worked hard for many years trying to get something done. I remember the last time we came up for reauthorization. You remember that, right? Vividly. Yes, about what was it, hours after it passed, a major disclosure was given to us all about the abuses that had taken place by our own FBI. This is an opportunity to rectify that and get us on a more optimal path of respect for the American citizen, their rights, their freedoms. The purpose of government is not to grant rights, it is to protect inherent rights. And this has been a failure, abjectly. So I'm honored to serve with you, and I would just report also that we've had a task force going in the House between several committees now for 7 or 8 months. And we have also been working on a product. There's a lot of overlap between this bill and the product coming out. I'm excited to see it because I believe that we're going to have an overwhelming bipartisan, bicameral passage of this important reform. And I don't think the American people want just reform, to be honest with you. If you talk about it, they will, and I'm with them, I would have soon seen this go completely away. But I recognize that there is concern that if we don't have reform, that we're not going to get anything done. Last thing I'll say on this, I'm begging our leadership of both houses, do not attach this to the CR or an omnibus. This is worthy of standing on its own. It must stand on its own. Every member of these bodies must be accountable and then hold our federal watchdog agencies accountable. Do not let this get caught up so where it just goes along business as usual. We can no longer afford the status quo. So I urge people and our leadership to go forward. I thank you again for your leadership on this, and let's get this done.
Thanks very much, Congressman. And at this point, here's where we are in the program. First, I want to introduce Sarah Jacobs. She's a terrific young member of Congress from California. She, in vintage kind of collegial tradition, she wants all our guests to speak. So let me call them all up. Bob, Sean, James, Joanna, Kia, and Elizabeth. Come on up, and you all are going to tell us why this is so important to you. And again, I want to thank the Congresswoman for her collegiality. Let's start with Bob.
Well, on behalf of the Project for Privacy and Surveillance Accountability, it's an honor to be here today, back with my former colleagues who are doing such important work. We are here at a key moment in our nation's history. In the digital era, with the advent of so many powerful new technologies, the ability of our government has never been greater to surveil each and every one of us and to store and search that data about every aspect of our lives. Nor has the evidence of abuse of these powers ever been greater. And so the need has never been greater to respect and protect the Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution. What Congress does in the next several weeks will define whether the freedom and privacy of Americans will be protected or whether we will become just another surveillance state. In order to avoid that, Congress must not only reform Section 702 of FISA, but we must leverage its expiration and reauthorization to include many provisions reforming other aspects of government surveillance and impose the same warrant requirements on government purchase of data from data brokers and strengthen the ability of Congress to conduct oversight and to hold accountable those who break the law. This bipartisan legislation accomplishes all of these goals and more and will become the greatest reforms ever to protect our Constitution and the privacy of all Americans. My thanks to Senators Wyden and Lee and Representatives Davidson and Lofgren, Chairman Biggs and Congresswoman Jacobs, and all gathered with them for the courageous leadership needed at this moment. Thank you.
Bob, thanks for all your leadership for all these years, and so glad you're here. Let's bring Sean up with Demand Progress.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Goodlatte. Thank you to all of our tremendous leaders here. This is a promising moment for Americans' privacy. Section 702 of FISA has been abused countless times to conduct illegal surveillance, including of people protesting the murder of George Floyd, January 6 suspects, journalists, and even members of Congress. Despite claims of internal reforms, none of which amount to the critical independent check that a court-issued warrant provides and that the Government Surveillance Reform Act would require, the most recent public disclosures prove that agencies continue to abuse FISA, including unlawful searches for information, sensitive information about online dating matches, a prospective tenant, and thousands of others. Abuses that law enforcement and intelligence agencies want us to accept and ignore. While Section 702 must not and will not be reauthorized without an overhaul to stop the constant abuses we have seen, this moment is about far more than one spying law. 77% of Americans want the government to obtain a warrant before buying our location information from data brokers, as the Government Surveillance Reform Act requires. Most Americans also want the government not only to get a warrant before conducting backdoor searches of Americans' information under Section 702, but also under warrantlessly acquired communications that occur under Executive Order 12333 without any oversight. The Government Surveillance Reform Act meets this once-in-a-generation moment and threads a delicate needle. It creates a path forward for FISA, and it meaningfully restores Americans' privacy. At this point, it is the government agency's opposition to a robust congressional debate over surveillance reform that poses the greatest threat to 702's continuation. Demand Progress, with a strong coalition of dozens of allied groups, as well as millions of Americans from across the political spectrum. We'll do everything we can to ensure Section 702 is not reauthorized without the critical reforms in the Government Surveillance Reform Act. And in so many words, it's time to fight like hell for Americans' privacy, and we will.
That sums it up. James, come on up. Appreciate your being here.
Thank you. So the U.S. intelligence community has repeatedly and frequently misused its authorities underneath the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, as well as underneath other authorities that grant them surveillance powers. And as these demonstrated abuses have been highlighted to the American people, what it does is it ultimately erodes their trusts in the very institutions that are responsible for keeping them safe here at home. And that is an unfortunate situation to find ourselves in. I think that, as Senator Wyden highlighted at the outset of this, it is not a mutually exclusive decision to go and reinforce our national security interests while promoting our civil liberties here. That is something that is unacceptable, and this strain in trust is something that I think is unsustainable in the long term. This is why I think that the Government Surveillance Reform Act is incredibly important. It contains so many critical things that go and ultimately restore our protections underneath the Constitution, hold these institutions accountable for their misuses when they do it looking forward, and ultimately, I think, put us on a path where we can restore that public safety trust and advance the national security mission more broadly speaking. We certainly commend Senators Wyden, Lee, Representatives Andy Biggs, and Warren Davidson and Zoe Lofgren for their leadership on this critical issue. It is far time now, between now and the end of the year, to go and get something done on this issue. It can't continue as it currently stands. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Let's bring up Joanna next.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, is very pleased to support and endorse the Government Surveillance Reform Act. This is because Asian Americans are all too familiar with being subject to increased and disproportionate scrutiny perpetrated under the guise of national security. Approximately 60% of Asian Americans are immigrants, which means that when it comes to the federal government's surveillance, whether pursuant to Section 702 of FISA or other surveillance authorities, we are likely to be incidentally spied on at a higher rate, simply because we have friends, family, and business associates who live abroad. This is highly concerning, given how the federal government is able to run backdoor searches through this data without a warrant. The Government Surveillance Reform Act is a critical step that would help to regulate the collection of Americans' sensitive communications and rein in the likely greater impact that such existing authorities have on communities of color. We're thankful for the tremendous bipartisan, bicameral leadership on display here today on this important issue, and we're eager to see Congress pass it in the weeks and months to come. Thank you.
Wonderful. How fitting. We've got Elizabeth, who has been working on these issues for years. If she's in the room, you're running with the right crowd.
Thank you so much, Senator. Good morning. The Brennan Center is proud to support this vital legislation. Over the past 20 years, changes in the law and technology have dramatically increased the government's ability to conduct warrantless surveillance of Americans and others in this country. This threatens our civil liberties, our civil rights, and our democracy. And it cannot be fixed through incremental or piecemeal changes to individual laws. What's needed and what this bill provides is a comprehensive approach to reining in warrantless surveillance of Americans, whether that takes place under Section 702, through overseas surveillance under Executive Order 12333, or by purchasing our most sensitive information from data brokers, thus evading the Fourth Amendment and statutory privacy protections. At the same time, this bill preserves the core functionality of Section 702 and the government's ability to protect our national security against foreign threats. The Brennan Center commends the sponsors of this bill for their vision, for their leadership, and for working across the aisle to protect the rights we all share as Americans. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. We're sort of at time to depart, but we can take a couple of questions from the press if you have something. Softball questions, feel free to give to me. Difficult ones you can give to my colleagues for the press. Yes, and tell us who you are, too.
Yeah,
so you know.
with Bloomberg Law. The White House, without having read the bill, apparently has already come out in opposition to a warrant requirement and a ban on commercially available data purchases. Do you have any response?
Yeah, I've heard of some interesting ways to measure your position on a piece of legislation, but announcing you haven't read it is a little bit unusual at the get-go. We're going to have an open door policy. I mean, the fact is that this is a bill that addresses a number of issues that should have been addressed years and years ago. But what we're not going to do is just wait till the very last minute, which has happened almost since I've been on the intelligence community, then say it's a scary world, and so we're just going to have business as usual. We believe that it's important to deal with these threats that we're facing overseas, our foreign adversaries. We believe it can be done in a way that's consistent with privacy. So when the White House or whoever is making this announcement for them has a chance to read our bill, we'll be interested in sitting down with them. We welcome any ideas for strengthening it. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Courtney from Law 360. Looking at the press release, I don't see any of the chairs or ranking members of the Judiciary or Intelligence Committees as co-sponsors. Have you spoken with them? If so, what have their reactions been?
I'll let them speak for themselves, but I think as members get into this, we're going to see, for example, if you want to protect Americans' location data, if you want to protect their browsing data, if you want to protect their data that now is being purchased by data brokers, this is the place you got to go. So we're going to continue to talk to all our colleagues. I've served on the Intelligence Committee for some time, Senator Lee. If you're talking about the Senate, we'll let our House colleagues chime in. So our door is officially open, and we welcome people who want to come on in and give us ideas and suggestions. I think we will have a very substantial bipartisan, bicameral bill that will grow. The coalition for it will grow in the days ahead as people see the breadth of it. Let me let my other colleagues who'd like to say something.
We have a good number of Democratic co-sponsors of this bill, including ranking members, for example, Pramila Jayapal and Lou Correa, who are ranking members of subcommittees in the Judiciary Committee, and we're reaching out to many others who are not on the committee. I think Warren had to go to another meeting, but certainly he has a number of Republican co-sponsors. So we think that this is something that not only is bipartisan, but as we study it and as we talk to our colleagues, we're gaining consensus on the need to do this. And it's worth pointing out that in past years, on the warrant requirement alone, we have had a majority of the House bipartisan pass that. So I'm optimistic that for the first time in more than a decade, we can finally do the reform that is necessary.
Here's what we're going to do now. Somehow we missed our friends from the ACLU. Kia may be floating around.
Right
oh, there, okay. What we'll do, if it's all right with you, let us take a couple of more questions from the press, and then we'll go to Kia. This is on me. Press, a couple more questions, and we got to go to Kia. Okay, Kia. And any of my colleagues want to say anything else? Please.
I want to thank Senators Wyden and Lee, Representatives Biggs, Davidson, Lofgren, and Jacobs for their work on this bill. When 702 passed 15 years ago in 2008, the ACLU sued within the hour to try to get it declared unconstitutional, and we've been fighting it in court ever since. In those 15 years, we've seen scores of abuses, and what's clear is that this bill should not be reauthorized absent fundamental reform. This legislation is what we view as fundamental reform, and the ACLU is proud to support it. The administration has said time and time again how important they view this authority. Well, I would tell them that this is the only bill that currently exists in Congress to reauthorize 702 in any fashion, and that Congress should not vote for any bill to reauthorize 702 that does not contain the reforms contained in the Government Surveillance Reform Act. Thank you.
One last press question. We'll stick around. I want to thank all my colleagues for being here, and as mentioned with just made, there is no bill out there that looks like this, and there hasn't been one. And I think it, as we have said, as part of the fact that the American people are telling us it's time to keep up with the times, and that's what our bill does. Yeah, of course, Senator Lee.
Just wanted to, Kia's remarks reminded me of a point that I think ought to be made here. ACLU was right to have had concerns about this all along. They were right to be sounding the alarm right from the beginning. One of the things that's so difficult about this area of the law is that Number one, in most circumstances, certainly would be the case here, in order to facially challenge legislation as facially invalid under the Constitution, you have to show that it's unconstitutional in all of its applications. That can be difficult to do because there are myriad applications in which you could lawfully, legitimately, constitutionally employ various provisions that we're talking about here. But there are also myriad possibilities for them to violate it, as we've seen, as we've now proven. Not just tens, but hundreds of thousands of times they've violated the Constitution in doing that. That, too, can be very difficult to establish when very often the people whose rights have been violated aren't even aware that their rights have been violated because they can't know, because these things are all classified. And they're going on in front of a court as to which there's no visibility from the outside. And so that's right. They've been right to raise these concerns from the very beginning. From the beginning, these provisions have been ripe with opportunities for constitutional mischief, and they've resulted in that, even more than I think many of us could have imagined at the outset, even though many of us were suspicious from the beginning. But that's why it's so important to fix this through legislation and to not sit back and say, well, we just got to get it reauthorized. And I think that, by the way, that might be, I don't want to speak for the White House, but I wonder whether whoever spoke on behalf of the White House might just still be thinking in terms of a binary on-off switch. It's understandable that they wouldn't want 702 to expire. Nonetheless, this is not an expiration that we're calling for. We're simply saying put some guide rails around it, some guardrails around it, so that it's harder to violate. And I'm confident that the White House and others who may have concerns right now will have a lot fewer concerns once they read it. And in particular, I think a lot of them will find it in their hearts to be able to compromise when they realize a clean reauthorization of 702 is not in the cards. It's not on the table. The American people have spoken much more so than 13 years ago when I first arrived here. This is an issue that people are aware of in every big city and small hamlet across the United States. They're concerned about this, and it doesn't matter whether they align left, right, center, they're worried. The people they've elected to represent them in the Congress are not eager to come in here and just reauthorize this thing without any modifications. So anyone still deluding themselves into thinking that a clean reauthorization of 702 is on the table, it's not.
Well said. Last word fittingly. The Congressman from California.
Just quickly, some of my colleagues have suggested it would be preferable just to let 702 expire. I'd like to point out that is not the best approach. 12333 gives really unbridled authority to the executive branch, and it is essential that that be part of the reform effort as it is in this bill. So this bill will provide greater protection to Americans than a mere expiration of the section. And I'd like to just say, so I don't want to embarrass him, but we've worked so hard on this, all of us, but Joe Zanoni, a lawyer on my staff, has worked nights, weekends, all year, and I want to just thank him for his extraordinary service. Thanks.
Bravo, bravo. Okay, folks, thank you.
Glad you made that last point.